The emergency alarm screamed through the bridge of the horizon's edge as Captain Jake Morrison felt his world turn upside down. Red lights flashed everywhere while sparks flew from broken control panels. The ship shook so hard that Jake had to grip his chair to stay upright. "Engine core is failing," shouted his engineer over the noise. "We have maybe 2 minutes before complete shutdown." Jake's mind raced. They were orbiting Kethavara, a moon that every spacer in the galaxy feared. It was home to creatures called stalkers, massive wolf-like beasts that had killed thousands of colonists over the years. No one who crashed on Kethavara ever came back alive. "Get to the escape pods," Jake ordered his crew. "That's an order." His crew of 12 ran toward the pod bay. Jake stayed behind to send out a distress signal, even though he knew it was useless. Galactic law was clear about Kethavara. No rescue missions. Too many good ships and crews had been lost trying to save people from that cursed moon. The ship lurched violently to one side. Jake barely made it to the last escape pod before the main hull cracked open. He could see his crew's pods launching safely as his own pod shot into space. At least they would make it to the emergency beacon station 3 systems away. Jake's pod spun as it fell through Kethavara's atmosphere. The heat shields glowed red-hot outside his small window. He could see the moon's surface getting closer. Dense forest covered most of the land, with strange blue and purple trees that seemed to glow even in daylight. Beautiful but deadly, the pod hit the ground hard. Jake's head snapped forward and everything went black. When he woke up, pain shot through his left leg. Jake looked down and saw his shin bent at an angle that made his stomach turn. The bone was definitely broken. He checked his equipment. The emergency beacon was cracked and dead. His medical kit had only basic supplies. Food and water for maybe a week if he was careful. Jake forced himself to stay calm. Panic would kill him faster than any stalker. He dragged himself out of the wrecked pod using his arms. The metal was still hot from entering the atmosphere. The forest around him was unlike anything he had ever seen. The trees had thick purple bark and leaves that glowed with soft blue light. Strange flowers hung from vines, giving off a sweet smell that made Jake dizzy. In the distance, he could hear sounds that made his blood run cold. Deep howls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jake knew those sounds from the survival videos every spacer had to watch. Stalkers, the galaxy's most feared predators. They stood 8 feet tall and weighed as much as a small transport vehicle. Their claws could cut through starship armor like paper. They hunted in packs and never gave up once they found prey. Using a piece of metal from his pod as a crutch, Jake started looking for shelter. Every step sent fire up his broken leg, but he had to find somewhere safe before dark. The howls were getting closer. He found a cave opening in a rocky hill about half a mile from the crash site. It was small but deep enough to hide in. Jake gathered some dead branches and made a simple barrier at the entrance. He knew it would not stop a stalker, but it might slow one down long enough for him to use his emergency blaster. As the sun set, the forest came alive with strange sounds. Things moved in the trees above him. Glowing eyes appeared and disappeared in the darkness. Jake sat with his back against the cave wall, blaster in his lap, trying not to think about all the people who had died on this moon. The first stalker appeared at the cave entrance just after midnight. Jake had seen pictures, but nothing prepared him for the real thing. The creature was enormous, with silver fur that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Its eyes glowed yellow like small suns. When it opened its mouth, Jake could see teeth as long as his fingers. The stalker stood at the cave entrance for a long time, just watching him. Jake held his blaster with shaking hands, knowing one shot would not be enough. More glowing eyes appeared behind the first one. A whole pack. But they did not attack. Jake waited for them to charge, to tear him apart like they had done to so many others. Instead, they just watched. One of them, a massive female with scars across her face, took a step forward. She sniffed the air and made a low rumbling sound deep in her throat. Then she backed away. For 3 days, the stalkers stayed near the cave but never came inside. Jake could see them moving through the trees during the day. At night, their eyes formed a circle around his hiding spot. He had no idea why they were waiting. Maybe they were playing with him, like cats with a mouse. On the 4th day, Jake decided to explore deeper into the cave. His food was running low and his water recycler could only make so much from the humid air. If he was going to die, he might as well know what was in his temporary home. The cave went back farther than he thought. Using his emergency light, Jake crawled through narrow passages until he found a larger chamber. That's when he heard the sound that changed everything. Soft whimpering like puppies crying. Jake followed the sound to a corner of the chamber where he found something impossible. 3 tiny stalker cubs, each no bigger than a house cat, huddled together next to the still form of their mother. The adult female was clearly dead, probably from giving birth. The cubs looked up at Jake with huge yellow eyes. They were so young their fur was still fluffy, not the sleek coat of adult stalkers. They were shivering from cold and hunger. Without their mother, they would die within days. Jake stared at the tiny creatures. These would grow up to be the galaxy's most feared killers. Every rational part of his mind told him to leave them alone. Let nature take its course. But as he looked at their small, helpless faces, he could not do it. He had always been a soft touch for anything young and defenseless. His ex-wife used to joke that he would adopt every stray animal in the galaxy if she let him. Jake made a decision that would change his life forever. He took off his jacket and gently wrapped the 3 cubs inside it. They snuggled against the warmth and stopped crying. Outside the cave, the adult stalkers had gone completely silent. Jake spent his first night with the cubs learning that baby stalkers were not much different from any other young animals. They cried when they were hungry, cold, or scared. They needed warmth and food and someone to take care of them. The 3 little ones had curled up against Jake's chest, using his body heat to stay warm. He could feel their tiny hearts beating fast against his jacket. One of them, the smallest with white patches on her dark fur, kept trying to nurse on his fingers. She was clearly the weakest of the 3. Jake had divided his emergency food bars into tiny pieces, mixing them with water to make a paste the cubs could eat. It was not ideal, but it was better than letting them starve. His water recycler worked overtime to keep up with their needs and his own. During the day, Jake could hear the adult stalkers moving around outside the cave. Sometimes one would come to the entrance and make soft calling sounds. The cubs would perk up their ears and make small chirping noises back. Jake realized the adults were checking on the babies, making sure they were safe. It was incredible. The galaxy's most dangerous predators were acting like worried relatives. By the end of the first week, Jake had settled into a routine with his unexpected family. The cubs were getting stronger on his makeshift food mixture. They had started to explore the cave chamber, tumbling over each other and play. Jake found himself giving them names. The biggest one, a male with a bold attitude, became Charlie. The middle-sized one, who was always getting into trouble, became Sam. The little female with white patches became Lucy. Jake's broken leg was healing, but not well. Without proper medical equipment, the bone had set crooked. He would always walk with a limp now. But he could move around the cave system better, exploring the different chambers and passages. The cave was larger than he had first thought. It had several rooms connected by narrow tunnels. In one chamber, Jake found an underground stream with clean water. In another, he discovered strange glowing crystals that gave off light and heat. The cubs loved playing near the warm crystals. As the cubs grew bigger and more active, they started following Jake everywhere. When he went to get water, 3 little shadows trailed behind him. When he sat down to eat, they gathered around his feet hoping for scraps. At night, they still slept curled up against him, but now they were big enough to keep him warm too. Jake started talking to them the way people talk to pets. He told them about his life before the crash, about the stars he had visited and the things he had seen. The cubs seemed to listen, their yellow eyes fixed on his face. Sometimes they would tilt their heads like they were trying to understand. One morning, Jake woke up to find Lucy missing. He searched the whole cave system but could not find her anywhere. Panic set in. Had she wandered outside? The adult stalkers might not recognize her as one of the cubs they were protecting. Jake was getting ready to search outside when he heard barking. Not the deep howls of adult stalkers, but higher-pitched sounds. He followed the noise to find Lucy at the cave entrance, playing with 2 adult stalkers. Jake froze, expecting the worst. But the adults were being incredibly gentle with the cub. They were play fighting, carefully keeping their claws sheathed and their massive jaws closed. Lucy was having the time of her life, pouncing on tails and wrestling with creatures 50 times her size. When the adults noticed Jake, they did not run or attack. They just watched him calmly. One of them, the scarred female Jake had seen the first night, even dipped her head slightly. It looked almost like a nod of respect. From that day forward, the boundary between the cave and the outside world started to blur. The cubs would venture out during the day to play with the adults. Jake started sitting at the cave entrance, watching his adopted children learn to be stalkers. He saw them learn to hunt small creatures, their movements becoming more coordinated each day. He watched them practice the complex howling calls that stalkers used to communicate. Most importantly, he saw how the adult pack treated them with infinite patience and care. Jake began to understand that everything the galaxy believed about stalkers was wrong. They were not mindless killing machines. They were intelligent, social creatures with complex family structures. They mourned their dead, protected their young, and had individual personalities. The scarred female, who seemed to be the pack leader, was careful and thoughtful. A younger male was playful and energetic. An older male with gray around his muzzle was wise and patient with the cubs. They were people, just not human people. After a month, Jake realized the adult stalkers had accepted him as part of their pack. They brought him gifts of fresh meat from their hunts. When it rained, they would gather at the cave entrance as if making sure he stayed dry. When he fell asleep outside during the day, he would wake up to find one of them lying nearby, keeping watch. The cubs were growing fast. Charlie was already the size of a large dog, with Sam and Lucy not far behind. Their baby Fluff was being replaced by the sleek adult coat. Their teeth were getting sharper and their claws longer. But around Jake, they were still the playful babies he had rescued. Jake's own transformation was just as dramatic. Months of living in the wilderness had changed him. His soft spacer's body had become lean and tough. His pale skin was now tanned and scarred from climbing over rocks and pushing through thorny bushes. His hair had grown long and he had a thick beard. More importantly, his mind had changed. The constant fear of the first weeks had been replaced by something he never expected: peace. For the first time in his adult life, Jake felt like he belonged somewhere. The cubs needed him and he needed them. The adult pack had accepted him as family. The outside world felt like a distant memory. Sometimes Jake would remember his old life as a ship captain, traveling between the stars, but it seemed like something that had happened to someone else. This cave, this pack, these cubs were his real life now. Jake had stopped thinking about rescue. No one was coming to Kethvara anyway, but even if they did, he was not sure he would want to leave. The cubs were his responsibility now. They trusted him completely and he would not abandon them. As he watched Charlie, Sam, and Lucy playing with their pack aunts and uncles in the fading daylight, Jake realized something that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. He was happy, truly deeply happy for the first time in years. The beast had gone silent because its cubs were sleeping beside the human, but Jake was no longer sure who was protecting whom. 6 months after the crash, Jake had become something the galaxy thought impossible: a human member of a stalker pack. His daily life had fallen into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. He woke each morning to find Charlie, Sam, and Lucy sprawled around him, their bodies warm against the morning chill. The cubs were now the size of ponies, but they still acted like puppies around him. Jake had learned to read the forest like the stalkers did. He knew which plants were safe to eat and which ones would make him sick. He could find water by following the flight patterns of certain birds. He understood the meaning of different animal calls and could move through the woods without making a sound. The scarred female, who Jake had started calling Vera, had become his closest companion among the adults. She seemed to understand that Jake was different from other humans, that he belonged with the pack in a way that defied explanation. When Jake went foraging, Vera often walked beside him, her massive presence keeping other dangerous creatures away. The cubs had grown into their roles as well. Charlie had developed into a natural leader, bold and protective of both Jake and his siblings. Sam was the explorer, always finding new places and getting into harmless trouble. Lucy, despite being the smallest, had become the smartest, often solving problems that stumped the others. Jake had built himself a more comfortable living space in the cave system. Using salvaged materials from his escape pod and natural resources from the forest, he had created a workshop area, a sleeping chamber, and even a primitive kitchen. The cubs loved watching him work, often trying to help in ways that were more cute than useful. The pack's territory covered several square miles of dense forest. Jake had learned its boundaries by walking patrol routes with the adults. He discovered ancient ruins scattered through the woods, evidence that some intelligent species had lived on Kethvara long ago. The stalkers seemed to treat these places with respect. never denning in the ruins or marking them as territory. Life was peaceful until the day the rival pack arrived. Jake first noticed something was wrong when Vera and the other adults became restless. They paced at the edge of their territory, making low warning growls. The cubs sensed the tension and stayed closer to the cave than usual. Even Charlie, who was normally fearless, seemed nervous. That evening, Jake heard howls coming from the south that were different from his pack's calls. Harsher, more aggressive. Vera's ears flattened against her head and she bared her teeth. Jake did not need to speak Stalker to understand the message. Enemies were coming. The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn. Jake woke to the sound of fighting outside the cave. Terrible snarls and roars echoed through the forest as two packs clashed in brutal combat. He grabbed his emergency blaster and rushed to the cave entrance, where he found the cubs huddled together in terror. Through the trees, Jake could see the battle. His pack was outnumbered 2-1 by a group of larger, more aggressive stalkers. These invaders had darker fur and cruel yellow eyes. They fought with a savagery that was different from his pack's controlled strength. Vera was in the thick of the fighting. Her scarred face twisted in a snarl as she faced off against the enemy pack leader, a massive black male with one torn ear. Around them, the other adults from Jake's pack fought desperately to protect their territory. Without thinking, Jake ran toward the battle. He could not let his family fight alone, even if his small human body would be useless in a fight between titans. But as he reached the edge of the combat zone, one of the invading stalkers broke away from the main fight and charged straight at him. Jake raised his blaster, knowing one shot would not stop a creature that size. The stalker was almost on top of him when Charlie came out of nowhere, slamming into the enemy with all his young strength. The two stalkers rolled across the ground, snapping and clawing at each other. Charlie was brave, but still just a teenager. The adult stalker was bigger and more experienced. Within seconds, the enemy had Charlie pinned, jaws aimed at his throat. Jake screamed and fired his blaster, the energy beam catching the attacker in the shoulder. The wounded stalker spun toward Jake with a roar of pain and rage. This time there was no escape. But before the creature could reach him, Vera appeared like a silver thunderbolt. She hit the enemy stalker with such force that Jake heard bones break. The fight was over in seconds. Vera stood over the defeated enemy, blood dripping from her muzzle. She looked at Jake and Charlie, checking to make sure they were both unharmed. Only then did she return to the main battle. The fight lasted another hour, but the tide had turned. The invading pack, having lost their strongest fighter, began to retreat. Vera's pack pursued them to the territory border, making sure they understood never to return. When the battle was over, Jake surveyed the aftermath. 3 members of his pack were wounded, including an older male named Gray who had a deep gash across his ribs. The cubs were shaken but unhurt. Charlie had a few scratches but was proud of his first real fight. Jake did what he could to help the wounded. His basic medical training was not much, but he cleaned wounds and applied pressure bandages made from his spare clothing. The stalkers accepted his care with surprising patience, understanding that he was trying to help. Over the following days, Jake tended to the injured pack members. He brought them food and water, changed their bandages, and kept them company during their recovery. Gray, the older male, seemed especially grateful for Jake's attention. He had always been somewhat aloof, but now he treated Jake with the same affection he showed his own packmates. The attack had changed something fundamental in the pack's relationship with Jake. Before, they had accepted him as a strange but harmless member of their group. Now they saw him as someone who would fight beside them, who would risk his life to protect the pack. He had proven himself in the way that mattered most to stalkers. He had shown courage when it counted. Vera's behavior toward Jake shifted as well. She began including him in pack decisions, sitting beside him during the evening gatherings where the adults would plan the next day's activities. She would touch her nose to his hand in a gesture Jake had learned meant deep trust and affection. The cubs were affected too. They had seen Jake fight to protect Charlie, and their respect for him grew. They began bringing him gifts from their hunting practice, small animals they had caught or interesting objects they had found. Lucy started sleeping pressed against his side instead of just near him, a sign of complete trust. As Jake sat by the fire pit he had built outside the cave, watching his pack family settle in for the night, he reflected on how much had changed. He was no longer just a human living among stalkers. He was a pack member, with all the responsibilities and privileges that came with that role. The cubs sprawled around him in various positions of comfortable sleep. Charlie's head rested on Jake's lap while Sam and Lucy curled up against his sides. Vera lay nearby, one eye always open to watch for danger. The other adults formed a protective circle around them all. Jake had found something on this deadly moon that he had never had in human space. A family that would die for him without question, just as he would die for them. The beast had gone silent not from fear but from love, and in that silence Jake had found his true home. 2 years had passed since Jake's ship crashed on Kethavara. The cubs had grown into powerful young adults, nearly the size of their pack elders. Charlie had developed into a magnificent specimen with a silver coat like Vera's, his natural leadership abilities making him popular with the other young stalkers. Sam had become the pack's best scout, able to move through the forest like a ghost. Lucy, still the smallest but clearly the smartest, had learned to communicate with Jake in ways that seemed almost like language. Jake himself had transformed completely. His once soft spacer's body was now lean and muscled from years of wilderness living. Scars from various adventures marked his arms and chest. His hair hung to his shoulders and his beard was thick and wild. Anyone from his old life would not have recognized him. He had become fluent in the complex body language and vocal signals that stalkers used to communicate. He could track prey through the forest, find edible plants in any season, and read weather patterns in the sky. Most importantly, he had learned the deep social bonds that held stalker packs together. He was no longer just living with them, he was one of them. The pack had grown to accept Jake's strange human needs. They understood that he required shelter from rain, that he needed to cook certain foods, and that he collected odd materials for his various projects. In return, Jake had learned to contribute in ways that helped the pack. His human intelligence allowed him to solve problems the stalkers could not. Like creating simple tools or planning complex hunts, life had settled into a comfortable pattern when the sensors arrived. Jake was foraging near the old crash site when he noticed the tiny metal objects scattered through the trees. Each one was no bigger than his thumb, designed to look like natural seed pods. But Jake recognized military surveillance equipment when he saw it. Someone was looking for him. He gathered as many sensors as he could find and brought them back to the cave. The technology was definitely human, probably dropped from orbit by a long-range reconnaissance probe. After 2 years, someone had finally come to investigate his disappearance. Jake's feelings about potential rescue were complicated. Part of him missed human contact, missed books and music and hot showers, but the larger part of him was terrified of losing his family. Charlie, Sam, and Lucy were his children in every way that mattered. Vera and the pack were his brothers and sisters. How could he explain that to a rescue team? 3 days after finding the sensors, the rescue ship arrived. Jake first spotted it through the forest canopy, a sleek military vessel with the markings of the Galactic Fleet. It landed in a clearing about 2 miles from his territory, far enough away that the pack was not immediately alarmed, but close enough that Vera and the other adults became watchful. That evening, Jake heard human voices calling his name through the forest. A search team was working its way toward his location, following the signal from the sensors. Jake realized he had a choice to make, and he had to make it quickly. He could hide deeper in the forest and wait for the humans to give up and leave. They would never find him if he did not want to be found, but something made him curious about who had come looking for him after all this time. Jake left the pack at the cave and walked toward the human voices. He found the search team setting up camp in a small clearing. There were 6 soldiers in full environmental suits, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. Leading them was a man Jake recognized immediately. Admiral Roy Blake, his former commanding officer. Jake stepped into the clearing and watched as the soldiers spun around, weapons raised. Behind their visors, he could see shocked faces staring at him. To them, he must have looked like some kind of wild man. Clothes made from animal hides, hair hanging loose, beard unkempt, body marked with scars. "Jake Morrison," Admiral Blake said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Son of a bitch, you're actually alive." "Hello." "Roy," Jake replied, surprised at how strange his own voice sounded after years of mostly communicating with growls and gestures. The reunion was awkward. Admiral Blake wanted to know everything about how Jake had survived on a world that had killed thousands of others. Jake gave him a carefully edited version of events, leaving out most details about the stalkers. He said he had found shelter in caves and learned to forage for food. He did not mention his pack family. "We're here to bring you home, Jake," Admiral Blake said. "The whole fleet thought you were dead. Your crew made it out safely, but when your pod's beacon went dark, we assumed the worst." "How did you find me?" Jake asked. "New long-range sensors picked up human life signs. Took us 2 years to organize a mission here. The Council still classifies Kathvara as too dangerous for rescue operations, but I pulled some strings." Jake felt grateful that Roy had come for him, but also trapped. How could he explain that he did not want to be rescued? That leaving would mean abandoning the only real family he had ever known? "I need time to think," Jake said. Admiral Blake frowned. "Think about what?" "Jake, this is a rescue mission. We're here to bring you home. This is my home now." The words hung in the air between them. Admiral Blake stared at Jake as if he had declared himself insane. The soldiers shifted nervously, hands never straying far from their weapons. "Jake, you've been alone on this hell world for 2 years. It's understandable that you might be suffering from some psychological effects, but you're coming with us. That's an order." Jake felt anger rising in his chest. Roy was treating him like a broken tool that needed to be fixed, not like a person who had made a life for himself. "I'm not under your command anymore, Roy. I resigned from the fleet the day my ship crashed." "You can't resign while missing in action. Legally, you're still a fleet officer, and I'm ordering you to return with us." The conversation was interrupted by a low, rumbling sound from the forest. The soldiers raised their weapons as 8 massive shapes emerged from the trees. Vera led the pack into the clearing, moving with the fluid grace that made stalkers so dangerous. Behind her came Charlie, Sam, Lucy, and 4 other adults. "Dear God," one of the soldiers whispered. "How are they not attacking?" Jake walked calmly toward the pack. Vera nuzzled his hand while the cubs gathered around him, clearly agitated by the presence of strangers. To the humans, it must have looked like magic. The galaxy's most feared predators were acting like domestic animals around a man they thought had been living alone in caves. "This is why I can't leave," Jake said quietly. "They're my family." Admiral Blake stared in shock as Jake scratched Charlie behind the ears and whispered something to Lucy that made her calm down. The stalkers arranged themselves protectively around Jake, but they did not threaten the humans. They simply waited. "This is impossible," Admiral Blake said. "Stalkers don't behave this way. They're killing machines." "No," Jake replied, his voice firm. "They're people. Just not human people. And these 3 are my children." Admiral Blake pulled out a communication device. "Base camp, this is Blake. We have located Morrison. But the situation is, complicated. I need to speak with Fleet Command immediately." That night, Jake returned to the cave with his pack while the humans made camp in the clearing. He had until morning to decide between 2 worlds, the human civilization he had been born into, or the stalker family he had chosen. As he lay surrounded by his sleeping pack, listening to Charlie's steady breathing and feeling Lucy's warmth against his side, Jake realized the decision had already been made long ago. The question was whether he would have the courage to stand by it when morning came. The morning brought Jake's decision into sharp focus when a new emergency signal crackled through Admiral Blake's communication equipment. A civilian transport ship had crashed on the far side of Kathvara during the night. The ship carried a family of colonists, 2 parents and 3 young children, all now stranded in hostile territory. "We need to mount a rescue operation immediately," Admiral Blake told his team as Jake listened from the edge of their camp. "But it's going to take us at least 3 days to cross that terrain safely. In this environment, they might not have 3 hours." Jake studied the tactical display on Blake's portable computer. The crash site was 40 miles away through some of the most dangerous forest on the moon. The route would take the rescue team through territories controlled by wild stalker packs, creatures that had not learned to tolerate humans. "There's another way," Jake said quietly. Admiral Blake looked up from his planning session. "What do you mean?" "My pack can reach them in 6 hours. We know paths through the forest that your equipment can't detect. Safe routes that avoid the wild packs." "Absolutely not," Blake said immediately. "I'm not sending you into that wilderness with a bunch of predators. Our mission is to bring you home safely, not watch you get torn apart by aliens." Jake felt Charlie brush against his shoulder. The young stalker had been watching the humans all morning, trying to understand why his adopted father seemed so troubled. Lucy and Sam flanked Jake on either side, their intelligent eyes fixed on the tactical display. "They already understand. Jake said, gesturing to his pack. Stalkers are highly intelligent. They can sense distress calls just like we can. They know there are people in danger. To demonstrate his point, Jake made a series of low growls and whistles in the stalker communication language. Vera's ears perked up immediately. She moved to the tactical display and sniffed at it, then looked toward the forest in the exact direction of the crash site. The human soldiers stepped back nervously as Vera let out a deep, resonant call. From the forest around them, answering calls came back. Within minutes, a dozen adult stalkers had gathered at the edge of the clearing. They formed a loose pack formation, clearly ready to travel. "How is this possible?" one of the soldiers whispered. "Because they choose to help," Jake replied, "just like humans do." Admiral Blake stared at the assembled stalkers, his military mind calculating odds and possibilities. "Even if this works, how do we know they won't attack the survivors? These people will be terrified when they see a pack of stalkers approaching." "I'll be with them," Jake said. "They trust me. I can make the survivors understand that we're there to help." Blake was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded grimly. "Go, but I want constant communication. First sign of trouble, you abort and return immediately." Jake strapped on his emergency gear and mounted Vera's massive back. It was something he had learned to do over months of practice, though it still amazed him how gently such a powerful creature could move when carrying him. Charlie, Sam, and Lucy took positions around them, while the other adult stalkers spread out in a protective formation. The journey through the forest was unlike anything the human observers could have imagined. The stalkers moved like flowing water, finding paths through dense undergrowth that seemed impossible. They communicated constantly through subtle sounds and gestures, coordinating their movement with precision that would have impressed any military unit. Jake felt the familiar joy of running with his pack. This was how stalkers were meant to travel, together with purpose, protecting their own. As they covered mile after mile in effortless bounds, Jake realized he was exactly where he belonged. They found the crash site just as Jake had predicted, 6 hours after leaving the human camp. The civilian transport had come down hard in a rocky canyon, its hull cracked open like an egg. Smoke rose from the wreckage, and Jake could hear voices calling for help. The survivors were huddled in the shadow of their broken ship, a man and woman in their 30s, and 3 children ranging from about 5 to 12 years old. They were uninjured but clearly in shock. When they saw the stalkers approaching, the family pressed themselves against the wreckage in terror. "Please," the man shouted. "We have children. Don't hurt them." Jake slid down from Vera's back and walked slowly toward the family, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. "My name is Jake Morrison," he called out. "I'm human like you. We're here to help." The family stared in disbelief as Jake approached. He must have looked like something from a nightmare. A wild man emerging from the forest accompanied by the galaxy's most feared predators. But his voice was gentle and his eyes were kind. "The stalkers won't hurt you," Jake explained as he reached the family. "They're here to help rescue you. I know it's hard to believe, but you have to trust me." The youngest child, a little girl with brown pigtails, peeked out from behind her mother. "Are they like big doggies?" she asked in a small voice. Jake smiled. "Something like that. Would you like to meet them?" Under Jake's careful guidance, the family slowly approached the pack. Vera lay down to make herself less intimidating, and Charlie, Sam, and Lucy gathered around Jake in their most gentle poses. The children's fear gradually gave way to wonder as they realized these massive creatures meant them no harm. "How is this possible?" the father asked as his son hesitantly petted Lucy's silver fur. "They're not what the galaxy thinks they are," Jake replied. "They're intelligent, caring beings. They choose to help because it's the right thing to do." The return journey took longer because of the human passengers, but the stalkers adapted their pace accordingly. They took turns carrying the tired children, their massive jaws carefully gripping the youngsters' clothes to lift them onto their backs. The parents rode with Jake and Vera, still amazed by the gentle treatment they were receiving. When they reached Admiral Blake's camp, the military team was stunned into silence. They watched as stalkers carefully set down human children, as the pack gathered protectively around the rescued family, as Jake translated between 2 species that had been at war for generations. "This changes everything," Admiral Blake said quietly as he watched the oldest child give Charlie a goodbye hug. The rescue ship arrived the next day to collect the civilian family. As they prepared to leave, the mother approached Jake one last time. "Come with us," she said. "You saved our lives. You belong with other humans." Jake looked back at his pack, gathered at the edge of the forest. Vera was watching him with those intelligent yellow eyes. Charlie, Sam, and Lucy sat in a neat row, waiting patiently for him to return to them. This was his family. This was his home. "Thank you," Jake said to the woman, "but I'm already where I belong." Admiral Blake agreed to an unprecedented arrangement. Jake would remain on Kethvara as the first human stalker cultural liaison, establishing a research station where others could learn what he had discovered. The galaxy would slowly come to understand that the creatures they had feared were actually potential allies. Years later, Jake sat outside his expanded cave home, now a small research facility. The station had hosted dozens of scientists and diplomats, all learning about stalker culture and intelligence. Charlie, Sam, and Lucy had cubs of their own now, a new generation that grew up understanding that humans and stalkers could be family. Vera, now elderly but still dignified, lay beside Jake in the evening sun. Around them, 3 generations of stalkers played and hunted and lived their lives in peace. The forest that had once been a place of terror had become a symbol of hope for the galaxy. Jake watched a human researcher carefully, documenting pack communication patterns while young. Stalkers patiently demonstrated their language for her. He saw his own grandcubs as he thought of them, playing gentle games with visiting human children. The beast had gone silent not from fear, but from love. And in that silence, 2 species had learned that family has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choice. Jake had chosen the pack and they had chosen him back. Together, they had changed the galaxy's understanding of what was possible when creatures chose compassion over fear. As the stars came out above Kethvara, Jake felt the familiar weight of sleeping cubs against his legs and the reassuring presence of his pack around him. He was exactly where he had always been meant to be, home.